So to end this unit, I want to talk about this issue of punishment. And the Hi-Fi Nation episode that I'm going to have you guys listen to, I think it does a really good job with this. There's a couple more Hi-Fi Nation episodes in the season that talk about issues and punishment. I'm not going to have you guys listen to all of them. But, you know, I think there are a lot of interesting questions people are raising these days about reforming American punishments. There's a general sense that they're too harsh, which I honestly tend to agree with. And I think there's good philosophical arguments for that. But, you know, generally people don't dig into deeper questions when they talk about punishment. They don't ask about why we even do it at all, what the point of it is, right? You know, we often take it as a given, we should punish criminals, right? You do something wrong, we should punish you. Well, there's something a little weird about that, though, and I just want you guys to notice that. For both moral theories that we've talked about, Kantianism and utilitarianism, there's something a little odd about punishment, or there seems to be. I think both theories are going to allow for punishment. We'll even say it serves a good purpose, but I want you guys to notice what's initially weird about it. What is that? Well, think of it this way, right? If you are a utilitarian, it's all about happiness, pleasure, and the absence of pain. And remember, utilitarians define pleasure and pain very widely, right? It's pleasure if you like it, it's pain if you find it unpleasant. Well, look, the whole point of punishment is that you find it unpleasant, right? If you like it, it's not a punishment. You know, I used to have a roommate. We were keeping his girlfriend's cat, Mr. Whiskers. And Mr. Whiskers was a bad cat. He's just a really crappy, not great cat. I mean, I like cats. Mr. Whiskers was not a good specimen of a pet house cat, right? And one of the things that made Mr. Whiskers crappy, and I promise this will relate back to punishment, is that Mr. Whiskers loved to just run outside and then you'd have to hunt him, right? So he escapes. My old roommate goes looking for him. You know, it's his girlfriend's cat. He spends 45 minutes traipsing around our house, the field next to our house, looking for this stupid cat at night with flashlight. When he finally catches Mr. Whiskers rolls over, slashes him down the palm of his hand. I mean, just gashes him. He comes in, his hand is pouring blood. He has Mr. Whiskers. He is furious. He throws Mr. Whiskers. I mean, he doesn't throw him. He just puts him somewhat angrily in the basement, right? Sets the cat at the top of the stairs, closes the door. He's like, all right, that's your punishment, cat. Now, look, here's the thing. I mean, for one thing, Mr. Whiskers is not really smart enough to understand why he's being put in the basement. But even if he were, Mr. Whiskers' second favorite thing to do besides running outside was to run in the basement. I mean, I don't know why. Maybe we had mice down there. Mr. Whiskers was not good at catching mice. He just would kind of look at them. But he loved to go in the basement, right? And my point here is putting Mr. Whiskers in the basement when getting into the basement was one of his favorite things in the world was not a punishment. My roommate didn't spend a lot of time around the cat. You know, me and my other roommate kind of knew it better. We're like, why does he do that? Mr. Whiskers wants to be there. He's not punishing him. He's rewarding him for gashing his hand in this bloody way, right? In the same way, anything that we do to people that they actually like is not a punishment, right? By its very nature, to count as a punishment, it must cause pain to the criminal. Or at least it must be designed to do it, right? Kantianism, punishment is also weird, right? Look, Kantianism says we should respect people's freedom, their ability to make free choices. Well, again, by its very nature, punishment invades that, right? If you tell me you've done this shabby thing, we're going to make you pay a fine. and if you don't pay a fine, we're going to like do some worse things to you. Even that interferes with my freedom, right? But imagine when you decide to put people in jail. Look, the whole point of putting people in jail, a lot of it anyway, is it deprives them of their freedom, right? How in the world can that fit with Kantianism, right? Even things like fines or community service, they seem an imposition on people's freedom. But jail, that seems to be, prison, that seems to be the whole point, right? And another, this puzzle of punishment, why do we do it? There's also the question of how do we set the appropriate punishments for crimes, right? This is one we're already talking about. Look, a lot of people, there are people in both the Democratic and Republican Party who think we need reform of punishments because they're too harsh. Well, but how do we figure out what punishment is too harsh and what punishment isn't, right? I mean, we have this vague sense that a lot of our punishments are too harsh. But how do we figure out what punishments are appropriate, right? Okay, so hopefully you guys can see the bigger issues, the bigger questions behind criminal punishment. Okay, so in the philosophical literature, just generally there are two main approaches to punishment. There is the utilitarian or consequentialist approach. You can guess which theory supports this approach. This is not a trick question. And there is the so-called school, the retributivism or retributivist approach to punishment. There are other ways to support retributivism besides Kantianism, but generally retributivists tend to be Kantians of some sort. And Kant's own theory of punishment was retributivist. These are two schools of thought about punishment and philosophy. But I think you guys will also see as we get into this that these kind of reflect some of how we already think about punishment. All right, keep that in mind as we get more deeply into it. Okay, so we've already said that the whole point of punishment is to make the criminal unhappy. Or at least, by design it does that. Well, punishment also costs money and resources. Money and resources that you could spend elsewhere to buy happiness or do things that will make people happy or prevent pain, right? And to imprison people, it costs, doesn't just cost resources, it costs a lot of resources and money, right? I looked this up, marketplace.org, that's where I got my information. It costs on average in the US $31,000 per year per inmate to keep someone in prison. That's a lot of money, right? That could, think of your tuition per year. If I'm not wrong, that could pay your tuition every year at TCC and have enough left over to pay 2 more people's tuition, right? That's a lot of money that could go elsewhere in our society where it could be used to do stuff that would create happiness, right? That's not even factoring in the whole criminal justice system, which also costs a lot of money, right? Judges, lawyers, DAs, public defenders, the whole thing is expensive. So given that its whole point is to make the criminal unhappy, and that it uses resources that could be used elsewhere to create happiness, how in the world could punishment be justified for a utilitarian? Think about that for a second. How, if you were a utilitarian, how in the world could you possibly think that punishment is justified? Criminal punishment and the whole system that goes with it. Well, look. Criminal acts create unhappiness, right? If you are the owner of a store, or even if you're just an employee, and people steal stuff. If you're the owner, it does real harm to you, right? You lose money. If you're the employee, it's really frustrating to watch people steal stuff. My wife used to work at Anthropology, and they had some woman come in and rob them blind. They weren't really allowed to stop her. She said it was just the most frustrating experiences of her life watching this woman, you know, hide clothes and stuff in her bag and clothes, right? Go down the line for other crimes, right? Someone smashes your window, that's going to ruin your day, right? I speak from experience. Nothing worse than finding your car window smashed, except maybe waiting for the glass guy to come as you nervously stare at the sky, praying it won't start raining, right? And these are pretty small potatoes crimes, right? Assault, murder, the big ones, you know, massive financial fraud like Bernie Madoff did that, you know, takes away people's retirement. You know, think about the damage those do. So crimes do a lot of damage, right? Little ones do a little amount, big ones do a big amount. Taken together, crime costs a lot of happiness. Well, what does punishment do? Punishment, or the threat of punishment, deters criminals, right? If we didn't have a law about shoplifting, how much shoplifting do you think there would be? If we didn't have a law about breaking into people's cars and stealing stuff, none of us would ever park on the street, ever, right? Everybody would want a locked garage. You know, there's a comedian, had a routine, you know, what would the world be like if murder weren't illegal? Well, there'd be a lot of it, right? We punish criminals because doing so deters them, and by deterring them, we prevent crime that creates the most happiness. Punishment for the utilitarian, there's other aspects of punishment, but they're fairly minor in their benefits. The main reason you punish for a utilitarian is deterrence. That is 90% or more of the point of punishment. And deterrence is supposed to have two parts, right? You deter the criminal himself or herself from doing things like this in the future. He or she's caught. Hopefully they learn a lesson. They won't do it again. More than that, though, punishment deters crime by making an example of the criminals who were punished. People see others go to jail or even pay a massive fine or something for other things, and they think, I don't want to do that. I don't want to go to jail, or I don't want to give up $500 for whatever traffic offense. I will avoid this crime. So hopefully keeps the criminal from doing it in the future. That's part of deterrence. An even bigger part is others see what happens to the criminal and it deters them. All right. So for a utilitarian, the main part of the point of punishment is deterrence. Well then, if you're a utilitarian, how do you figure out how much punishment is appropriate? You know, if our point is deterrence, how do we know how much to punish, right? Do we just punish all crimes the same? You know, we just want to deter crime in general. Well, that seems crazy. We're not, you know, it would be a weird theory that said we should punish shoplifters the same as we punish people who assault others, you know, and that we should punish people who beat other people up as much as murderers, right? Well, utilitarianism is not going to say that. Utilitarianism will actually say that there is a good reason to punish some crimes more than others, and that generally speaking, we should punish worse crimes more than lesser crimes. Well, why is that? How can a utilitarian say that? If you are a utilitarian, well, think about this. More punishment equals more deterrence. Just simple cost benefit, right? If the punishment for shoplifting were literally a good hard slap on the wrist, well, that wouldn't deter many people, right? If the punishment for shoplifting were, a weekend in jail, that would deter a lot more people. If the punishment were a month in jail, that would deter even more people, right? More punishment equals more deterrence. I'm going to bet you, if we made the punishment for murder 5 years in jail or 6 months in jail or whatever, if we really cut the punishment for murder, murder would spike tomorrow, right? You put more deterrence in place, more punishment, more people are going to think, well, this just isn't worth it. If you ever look at theories of rational choice in economics or even in philosophy, you're supposed to look at the chance of things happening versus the costs or the benefits, right? If the chance of getting caught remains the same and the punishment goes up, that gives you more and more reason not to do it. Well then, though, why not punish every crime to the max? Why not send shoplifters to jail for 20 years? Well, the reason is punishment and the deterrence you get from it are subject to diminishing returns. If you guys ever take economics classes, you'll come across this term. It's a pretty important one, pretty interesting one, and it affects punishment too. Diminishing returns. What this means, after a certain point, more effort, resources, money, etc. gets you less and less payoff. Think of it this way, right? It is really, really easy in a lot of classes to get from an F to a C, right? Maybe not easy, but it's not that hard, right? You do your work, probably going to make the difference between an F and a C, right? It's a bit harder to get from a C to a B, right? This is only one grade, but in a lot of classes, it'll take you more work to get from that C to the next grade up, a B, than it would to get from an F to a C, even though a C is 2 grades up from an F, right? And in a lot of classes, to get from a B to an A is even more work than it is to get from a C to a B, right? Same amount of effort won't get you the same amount of payoff in terms of a better grade. It gets harder and harder as you go up the scale. Or, here's another example, right? Imagine you have a house shopping budget in this region of $100,000. There is very, very little, unless you want to live way out in Suffolk, and even then it's probably not nice, that you could buy for $100,000, right? You can get somewhere to live, but it's going to be tiny, it's going to be far out, or it's going to be really shabby, right? Or maybe some combination of the three. You add $100,000, you go from barely being able to afford anything to a pretty nice house, right? Maybe not a house, but at least a condo. You can probably get something decent around here for $200,000, right? $300,000, the leap isn't as big, but there's still a pretty big gap, right? You can get something quite nice in a pretty good region around here for $300,000, right? But notice what happens. The gap between 100 and 200 is bigger than the gap between 200 and 300. And the gap between 400,000 and 300,000 is even smaller still, right? When you get like to super expensive mansions, how much of a difference is there between a house that's $3 million and a house that's $3,100,000, right? Not much at all, right? I don't know. Maybe a few more things have... I've never even looked at a house that expensive. I guess, I don't know. One of these days maybe I should. I guess they wouldn't kick us out. Anyway, my point being, here again you see diminishing returns. Each $100,000 gets you progressively less in the way of the things you want in a house. At a certain point, even if you had the money, it just stops being worth paying more for what you get, right? Well, punishment works the same way. More punishment costs more resources, creates more unhappiness, but you progressively get less deterrence. A lot of people who would otherwise do a crime won't do it simply because it's illegal and has some punishment, right? Look, a lot of people who would probably shoplift, if there were no punishment, will probably be deterred by even a weekend in jail, right? How much do I want this tube of lipstick or candy bar or whatever? Well, weekend in jail is not worth that, right? If we up it to a month, some of the people who won't be deterred by a weekend in jail will now be deterred. But, think about the people who aren't deterred by a month in jail for shoplifting, right? What percentage of them are going to be deterred by 6 months? What percentage by a year, right? You get less and less deterrence very quickly. Now, so after a certain point, the extra deterrence you get from more punishment isn't worth what you pay in resources or even unhappiness to the criminal. Now look, where that point is depends on the crime in question. I'm going to guess that even for murder, we probably hit diminishing returns pretty quickly. Probably even with just a year or two in jail, right? But given how much unhappiness murder creates, even a little bit more deterrence is worth it to prevent some extra murders. Given how much unhappiness, hurting others like direct assault creates, even a little bit more deterrence is generally worth it, right? But for some crimes, shoplifting, well, you get to a point very quickly where preventing a few cases of shoplifting isn't worth the extra cost and punishment. You get to that point a lot later, but eventually hit it with, people beating people up. With murder, it's even further out than it is with beating people up, right? So hopefully you guys understand this utilitarian approach. Some crimes cause more unhappiness, so it's worth paying more to deter extra cases of those, even though we quickly get less and less deterrence for more punishment. All right, one final point with utilitarianism. In our system and in systems generally, we don't punish children or the insane. We have a weird approach to children. At some point, we don't punish them, then progressively we kind of punish them. We kind of treat it like reform, and then eventually we punish them like adults, right? But look, if a 3-year-old shoots somebody, we are not going to send her to jail, right? If you guys ever watch The Simpsons, Maggie shoots Mr. Burns. Ha ha, funny. Maggie being the baby, right? But even in the real world, if a baby accidentally shot someone, we are not going to send that baby to jail. The same goes for people who are legitimately insane. Now, defining insanity is hard, but people who are insane, we generally don't punish. We force them to get help. We, put them in institutions so they can't harm people, but we don't treat that as punishment. So why is that for the utilitarian? Well, the point of punishment is deterrence. And because they're not rational, children and the insane and others who are not responsible for their actions can't be deterred. People who commit crimes sleepwalking, right? If you accidentally, slug your roommate in the face because he wakes you up while you're sleepwalking, punishment's not going to deter sleepwalkers from doing things while they're sleepwalking. And what's more, you don't need deterred because you're not the kind of person who goes out committing crimes, right? Punishing in these cases wastes resources and creates needless unhappiness. You don't get any deterrence out of it, really, but you still pay the cost, so there's no real point in doing it. Okay. So hopefully you guys understand, there's a lot going on here, but hopefully you understand the basic utilitarian approach to punishment. Next lecture, we will get more deeply into this and talk about some of the things they say and discuss in the Hi-Fi Nation episode about reform to the criminal justice system.